He was big. Everyone talks about that. He was 6'4" in an era when people were shorter. His arms were long for his height. His hands were big for his arms. They were huge, mottled hands. He grabbed your lapel. He leaned into you. And this one man said to me, he got bigger when he talked to you because the passion was just boiling up within him.
And Robert Caro understands passion. For more than 30 years, he has concentrated on just one thing.
I, Lyndon Baines Johnson, do solemnly swear.
The life and times of Lyndon Baines Johnson, the larger-than-life 36th President of the United States.
So help you God. So help me God.
What makes Lyndon Johnson such a fascinating figure for you?
Well, he's fascinating because what I'm interested in is political power. In the second half of the 20th century, in my opinion, Lyndon Johnson was the governmental figure who best understood political power. You know, he says, whatever else they may say about me, I do understand power. I know where to look for it, I know how to find it, and I know how to use it.
And so Caro has spent decades writing a series of massive volumes about LBJ.
And they have made more Democrats.
The first 3 books detail his rise from Texas poverty to the most influential majority leader in Senate history.
So I come to you today full of admiration for Senator Johnson, full of affection for him.
The fourth, The Passage of Power, out this week, begins during the 1960 presidential campaign, when Johnson, to his amazement, is outmaneuvered for the Democratic nomination by the aristocratic young upstart, Massachusetts Senator John Kennedy.
The District of Columbia cast 9 votes for Jack Kennedy.
Johnson considered Kennedy a dilettante.
He said Kennedy was pathetic.
He thought Kennedy was pathetic.
That's his word. He said, and have you ever seen his ankles? They're this big around, he said. Rickety, sickly, not a man's man. Johnson had contempt for Kennedy.
But Caro says the real blood feud was between Johnson and Robert Kennedy. Caro says Johnson's press secretary, George Reedy, told him the mutual dislike was clear from the moment LBJ and RFK met.
Reedy said, did you ever see 2 dogs come into a room and all of a sudden the hair rises on the back of their necks and there's this low growl? That's the way they responded to each other the first time they met.
One of the most dramatic accounts in the book is how, when Kennedy realizes he needs Johnson to win the South and offers him the vice presidency at the Democratic convention, Bobby Kennedy tries to undo it.
Bobby Kennedy came down 3 separate times to ask Lyndon Johnson to withdraw from the ticket.
Without success.
I've reached the conclusion that it would be the best judgment of the convention to nominate Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas for the office of vice president.
So help you God.
So help me God.
LBJ does help Kennedy win the White House, but as vice president, Johnson is treated with disdain by the whole administration.
And he was always so sad-looking that they called it a hangdog look. I wrote the long Texas strides were short and hesitant now, you know. He realized that he had really been put in a position where he didn't matter. These are files that relate to this book. Here are the interviews.
Caro keeps notes about that and thousands of other things filed away in his meticulously organized office known as the bunker.
When I'm interviewing somebody, I take the notes in one of these notebooks, and then that night I type them up.
He drafts and redrafts his manuscript, fretting over every word. I mean, what is it that drives you to keep doing this? Some people say maybe he's a little nuts, maybe he's a little obsessive.
Well, I'm sure, I don't know that people say I'm nuts. I've heard the word obsessive. Like you could say, well, You could have done his vice presidency and coming to the presidency in a couple of chapters. But what you couldn't have done in a couple of chapters is examine how, when President Kennedy is assassinated, he has no transition period. Like 1 minute he is not president, and another minute, the instant of that gunshot in Dallas, he is president. He gets back on Air Force One, he has to get off the plane in Washington and start making decisions. So you say, look at him do that. Let's examine exactly what he's doing here.
So you couldn't do that in a smaller book?
You could do it. I wouldn't want to do it that way.
In fact, Caro shows in great detail how Johnson immediately moves to consolidate his power.
Members of the House, members of the Senate.
Using his first address to Congress to draw the country together and jumpstart Kennedy's stalled legislative agenda.
So let us here highly resolve that John Fitzgerald Kennedy did not live or die in vain.
Caro came to the topic of Lyndon Johnson after writing another highly acclaimed biography of Robert Moses, the urban planner who created modern-day New York City. Caro won a Pulitzer Prize for that and another for one of his earlier books about Johnson.
Sometimes you do look at it and say, I did this. You know,
Must be a nice feeling.
it is a good feeling, yeah.
Especially because his last few books have been #1 bestsellers. They bought him and his wife Ina, who works as his researcher, this elegant apartment on Central Park. So I'm glad to see that you don't live in a garret as a struggling writer.
Well, we did for a while, but we don't anymore.
I think the president is doing a very good job in civil rights.
Caro ends this book with what is perhaps the greatest LBJ legacy, passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. While Martin Luther King was leading a revolution in the streets,
This bill is going to pass.
LBJ was threatening and cajoling a reluctant Congress into doing the right thing.
And this bill is going to be signed and enacted into law because justice and morality demand it.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
And though this volume ends on a high note, Caro, at age 76, is already at work on the next part of the story, how LBJ's presidency was ultimately undone by his pursuit of the Vietnam War. It will be Robert Caro's last word on the man who has dominated his life for so long.
People are always asking me, do I like him or dislike him? You know, those words don't even apply to my feeling about him. I'm watching a man who is a genius in the use of political power. I'm awed by him.